You won't believe it. Toto Wolff gets punched by Lewis Hamilton after the Bahrain Grand Prix. If this is your first time hearing about it, I highly recommend watching the video until the end before talking about it with your friends. Every detail matters. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. It was precisely 12:07 a.m. in the bone-dry silence of the Bahrain paddock, and though the race had ended hours ago, the true drama, the kind that doesn't get caught on a timing sheet or broadcast over team radio, was just beginning to ignite. The paddock, once alive with flashing cameras, team strategists barking over headsets, and engines roaring like lions in heat, now stood eerily quiet. The sand-dusted breeze that occasionally whispered through the empty walkways had gone completely still, as if even the desert itself sensed something unnatural in the air. The media had vanished, the fans long gone, the floodlights dimmed to a tired hum, casting long stretching shadows across pit lane. Yet inside the seemingly dormant Mercedes hospitality suite, something catastrophic had been quietly swelling, a pressure building with the silence of an earthquake before the rupture, an emotional supernova waiting for a gravitational collapse. People had been murmuring for days, barely audible whispers laced with caution, the kind of gossip that feels too dangerous to say aloud. Hamilton. Wolff. Friction. Not rivalry. Not disagreement. This wasn't about performance metrics or sponsorship obligations or who signed what clause in which NDA. This was personal. Years of buried resentment. 1,000 moments of passive-aggressive jabs, power plays, betrayals dressed as strategy decisions. Everyone could feel it. The kind of tension that makes your skin prickle. But no one, could have foreseen what was about to erupt between the most iconic driver-team principal duo in the modern history of Formula One. This was not a PR stunt. There were no Netflix cameras in sight. No boom mics dangling overhead. No press officers shepherding the narrative. This wasn't for Drive to Survive. This was raw, unfiltered reality. The kind that gets whispered about for decades. The kind that never makes it to the press release but becomes immortal in paddock legend. Because this wasn't just a flare-up. This was a punch. A real one. With blood, with bruises, with a silence so sudden and violent that people froze mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-thought. And it came from Lewis Hamilton. A 7-time world champion. The man with grace, with composure, with unmatched poise under pressure. The driver who could calculate tire degradation down to the decimal mid-race while changing brake bias and negotiating a contract in his head. That man. That icon. That legend. He snapped. And his knuckles collided with Toto Wolff's jaw with a sickening echoing crack that reportedly sounded like a starting pistol fired inside a church. But to understand how it came to that, to really grasp how this boiling point became a flashpoint, you need to rewind just minutes before. After the race, the paddock buzz had dulled into low murmurs. George Russell had dragged a battered Mercedes to P4, a result that felt more like CPR than celebration. Hamilton, now clad in Ferrari red, had ended P6, a position drenched in frustration, after wrestling with brutal tire drop-off, pit wall radio confusion, and a car that refused to play nice. His post-race obligations were fulfilled with robotic precision. The interviews, the photo ops, the obligatory handshake with a sponsor executive who didn't know downforce from drive-through. But beneath that calm surface, Hamilton was simmering. Not from the result. No. He'd driven worse weekends. It was something deeper. A betrayal that kept picking at the wound. He made his way toward the Mercedes hospitality building, not officially, not for cameras, not in any professional capacity. Just to speak with a few long-time allies still working in black and teal. People who had been with him in the trenches. Engineers. Physios. Mechanics. Human beings who still treated him like family. But before he could step inside, the door opened. And there stood Toto Wolff. Impeccably dressed, posture straight, that familiar unreadable stare behind thin-rimmed glasses. His arms folded. His lips tight. And without invitation, without warmth, without hesitation he spoke. "You know," he said, voice cool and measured, laced with a tone that sounded more like a verdict than a conversation, "you made a mistake. You should have stayed." That was it. One sentence. Like a switch being flipped in a dark room full of explosives. That single line, so casual, so calculated, so surgical, reached down and ripped something loose inside Lewis. It wasn't the words. It was the audacity. The implication. The revisionist history being weaponized by the very man who had, in Hamilton's eyes, slowly poisoned the relationship that once built an empire. The man who had, behind closed doors, leaned into Russell, who had prioritized the future over the present, who had let Lewis walk away when he didn't have to, who had pulled the strings, played the media, played the boardroom, played the long game, and now stood there, as if none of that had ever happened, pretending this was all Lewis's doing. Hamilton didn't respond with words. He took one step forward, then another. And before anyone could register what was happening, before even Toto could brace himself, Hamilton's fist was already mid-air. A blur. A missile of rage, heartbreak, betrayal, and unrelenting fury condensed into one devastating motion. It connected flush. The sound? Flesh on bone. The impact? Brutal. Sudden. Cinematic. Wolff's head snapped to the side, glasses flying, body stumbling back into a countertop with a metallic thud. One bystander let out a horrified gasp. Another dropped their coffee. Someone in the back physically dropped to a crouch, instinctively thinking the fight might escalate into something worse. A security guard stood frozen, unsure whether this was real or some twisted promotional stunt gone rogue. Wolff didn't speak. He didn't retaliate. He straightened his posture, jaw visibly swelling, a stream of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, but his eyes didn't show shock. Only something colder. Something eerily calm. Something like confirmation, as if he had expected this moment, planned for it, even wanted it. Hamilton, chest heaving, didn't say a word. He just stared. No apology. No regret. Only the icy glare of a man who had finally unleashed what years of PR training, media coaching, and internal discipline had forced him to suppress. And then he walked out. Not a word spoken. Not a glance back. The door swung closed behind him with a soft hiss. Not a slam, not a bang. Just the quiet punctuation of a war declared in silence. The room didn't move for a full minute. Phones stayed in pockets. No one dared document it. Not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Because in that moment, everyone understood, they had just witnessed something historic. A fracture in Formula One that would never, ever be repaired. A rupture that would ripple through contracts, teams, media empires, legacies, and reputations like a shockwave. One punch, and the sport had changed forever. By sunrise, rumors were already spreading like wildfire. Emergency meetings. Legal consultations. Internal reviews. Mercedes issued a no-comment statement. Ferrari didn't even acknowledge the incident. Hamilton was nowhere to be seen. Wolff showed up to the morning briefing with a swollen jaw and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And behind the scenes, the sports power brokers were scrambling. FIA officials. Liberty Media executives. Major sponsors. All whispering the same thing. What the hell happens now? No one knows. But the one truth hanging over the paddock like a thundercloud is this. Formula One will never be the same again. And Bahrain? Bahrain will be remembered not for who won the race, but for the night two titans collided, not on track, but face to face. And only one of them walked away without looking back. The silence that followed was so loud it became deafening. Reality warped for a moment, as if time had hit pause out of sheer disbelief at what had just transpired. No one moved. No one breathed. The entire Mercedes hospitality suite, a place normally buzzing with precision, efficiency, and the low hum of elite motorsport machinery, had been transformed into the epicenter of a nuclear meltdown. People stood frozen in place, coffee cups suspended mid-air, laptops blinking forgotten updates, a tiramisu tray stuck halfway between the kitchen and oblivion. It was no longer a team environment. It was a battlefield, smothered in disbelief and drowning in raw, unfiltered tension. Witnesses, all of whom now avoid cameras like the plague, described the exact moment when the world seemed to collapse into a single breath. Lewis Hamilton, Formula One's knight in silver armor, had snapped. Not in a theatrical outburst, not in a media-fueled controversy. No. This was something darker. Something deeper. Something primal. His face, only seconds before a stoic mask of veteran calm, had shifted in an instant to something colder than steel, sharper than broken glass. His eyes weren't angry, they were surgical, locked onto Toto Wolff with the kind of intensity that could boil blood and fracture carbon fiber. There was no screaming, no wild gestures. Just a slow, deliberate step forward. One step. That's all it took. One step that detonated the atmosphere like dynamite in a church. George Russell, casually leaning in a corner with the detached coolness of someone used to drama but unprepared for revolution, suddenly bolted upright. The change in the air was physical. You could feel it against your skin. Like static before lightning. Like the moment before an avalanche. George's protein shake slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a dull thunk, completely ignored. He knew instinctively, this was not a disagreement. This was war. Then came the whisper. A whisper that carried more weight than 1,000 podiums. Lewis didn't shout. He didn't roar. He barely even moved his lips. Say that again. The words slithered through the air like a curse. Not a threat. A prophecy. Toto Wolff, ever the immovable object, looked back at him. His face didn't twitch. His posture didn't waver. His voice came out flat, emotionless, corporate polished. But behind the words, there was something acidic. You walked away to chase a fantasy. You were royalty here. Now you're nothing but a silhouette. And then it happened. Not a scream. Not a speech. Not a viral quote destined for headlines. Hamilton moved like a serpent uncoiling after years of being trapped in a cage. 1 second he was still. The next, he exploded. His right hand flew forward with terrifying speed, so fast it sliced through the air like a blade. No hesitation. No calculation. Just fury, pure and ancient, forged from betrayal, bitterness, and a sense of being discarded by the very dynasty he helped build. The punch landed with an impact that would be studied by sports physicists for years. The crack of bone meeting bone reverberated across the sweep like a sonic boom. It wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. A titan had struck another titan. The unspoken gods of the paddock had drawn blood. Toto's head whipped sideways, his glasses launched across the room like shrapnel, crashing against a steel wall and shattering into pieces that sparkled as they fell. Toto collapsed to the floor in a sprawl of disbelief. The man who had commanded the Mercedes Empire like a chess grandmaster now looked up from the ground, dazed and glassy-eyed, blood trickling from a clean split above his cheekbone. One hand instinctively pressed against his jaw, as if trying to hold his pride in place. But his gaze never left Hamilton. Not hatred. Not fear. Just a cold, hollow stare. A stare that said, "You were more than this. And now you're just another legend who couldn't handle the end of his reign." The room detonated into chaos. George Russell lunged forward, shoving Lewis back with all the strength he could muster, his eyes wide, voice cracking from shock as he yelled something. No one heard what. Mechanics rushed in, forming a human wall between the two giants, unsure whether to protect Toto from another hit or Lewis from the consequences of his own fury. A catering assistant dropped an entire tray of espresso cups, the crash sending ceramic shards skittering across the floor like confetti at a funeral. Someone screamed. Someone else gasped. A young intern ran from the room, eyes wide in terror, tears already forming. One engineer, a seasoned veteran who'd survived 4 team changes and 2 mid-season car overhauls, would later tell a journalist under anonymity, "It felt like watching Zeus come down from Olympus, only to punch Poseidon square in the face." The kind of moment that rips reality in half. Still on the ground, Toto slowly pushed himself into a seated position, the side of his face swelling rapidly. He didn't touch the blood. He didn't ask for help. He just stared straight ahead, lips slightly parted, stunned into a kind of sacred silence. His entire career, every political calculation, every risk and reward, every season spent balancing egos and engines, it all had just combusted in one unexpected blow. Lewis didn't say another word. He didn't apologize. He didn't gloat. He simply stood there, breathing hard, fists still clenched, eyes burning with a fury that seemed to transcend the moment. This wasn't about just one conversation. This was the culmination of years of simmering tension, of feeling erased, of being paraded, then discarded, of watching a dynasty he built be slowly handed off to others while he was expected to smile through it. Security arrived seconds later, actual security, not paddock assistants in polos with clipboards. These were crisis response professionals in black suits and communication earpieces, men trained to remove threats, not de-escalate drama. They didn't hesitate. They moved in formation, cutting a path through the confusion, locking eyes with Hamilton like he was a VIP threat at a G20 summit. But Lewis didn't resist. He turned away from Toto. walked toward the exit. No words. No glares. No dramatic final line. He didn't even collect his things. He walked like a man who had nothing left to lose, and everything to reclaim. Like someone who knew he had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed and had no intention of stepping back. The doors opened. Then they shut. And just like that, he was gone. The aftermath was indescribable. PR teams went into panic mode. Lawyers were called before medics. The FIA was alerted before HR. Social media exploded in real time, first in disbelief, then in obsession. Reddit threads multiplied like wildfire. Sky Sports canceled its planned post-race analysis and switched to full live coverage. WhatsApp groups across teams lit up like Christmas trees. Rumors flew. Hamilton's private jet was fueled and waiting. His legal team had activated a confidentiality clause. He'd spoken to Fernando Alonso. Netflix had requested every second of surveillance footage from that room. Back in the suite, Toto was escorted to medical. He refused a stretcher. Refused a statement. Refused everything except silence. That night, Mercedes went dark. No posts. No interviews. No damage control. Just a void. And in that void, the legend of the punch grew. Whispers turned to gospel. Eyewitnesses became mythmakers. And the motorsport world learned a brutal truth. Even gods bleed. And when they do, the earth shakes. Hamilton wasn't just breathing heavily, he was exhaling thunder. Each breath came out sharp and loaded, like a furnace trying to contain a volcanic eruption. His pupils were dilated, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it could snap steel. His fists, balled up and trembling, weren't just a sign of rage. They were a final message from a man who had carried an empire on his shoulders and watched it betray him in cold daylight. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't flinch. He didn't soften. His entire being was radiating a kind of fury that was ancient, personal, apocalyptic. This wasn't frustration. This was heartbreak weaponized into vengeance. And then he said it. A phrase that would echo through the hallways of Formula One like a curse, an indictment, a eulogy to everything Mercedes once stood for. I gave you everything. And you turned me into a scapegoat. The silence that followed was suffocating. Engineers froze in place. Junior staffers avoided eye contact. No one dared breathe too loudly. It was the kind of moment that feels like the air has been sucked out of the room, like time itself has paused to bear witness. This wasn't just a team falling apart, it was the violent, irreversible unraveling of a dynasty. By that point, security had already been summoned. Not the usual personnel, but discreet private contractors, trained, silent, emotionless. The kind of people who operate in shadows and only step into the light when things are truly dire. And this? This was as dire as it gets. Mercedes executives tried in vain to contain the detonation. But it was far too late. The paddock doesn't wait for press releases. It breathes gossip like oxygen. By 2 a.m., everyone knew. And not just vague whispers. Specifics. Quotes. Names. Timelines. Entire retellings of the confrontation, each version more dramatic than the last, all of them painting the same picture, the final collapse of the Hamilton-Mercedes alliance. Journalists couldn't type fast enough. Team principals held emergency briefings. PR departments worked through the night trying to formulate narratives, excuses, spin. Rival drivers were seen huddling in quiet corners, shaking their heads in disbelief, some in concern, others in thinly veiled amusement. The entire world of Formula One had come to a standstill. And at the center of the maelstrom stood Lewis Hamilton, betrayed, enraged, unrelenting. Some whispered that Toto had provoked him on purpose. That the confrontation wasn't accidental. That Wolff, with all his political cunning, knew exactly which buttons to press and did it anyway, maybe even wanting a public explosion. Others said Lewis had been suppressing this rage for well over a year, that it had been building up like magma under pressure, ever since Mercedes chose to ignore his desperate, repeated warnings during the car development phases of 2022 and 2023. Years where he pleaded for change, offered detailed feedback, and championed innovations that were later proven to be correct, but were dismissed as distractions at the time. The very concept he had proposed for the car was initially rejected, only to be sheepishly admitted by the team a year later that it was, in fact, the superior direction. The damage, of course, was already done. And it wasn't just about cars. It was about respect, identity, power. Hamilton had felt his voice diminish within the team that once revolved around him. He had felt himself being sidelined, not overtly, but in subtle corrosive ways, being left out of strategic meetings, having his suggestions minimized, being treated like an aging relic instead of a 7-time world champion. His loyalty had been commodified, taken for granted, his legacy slowly diluted by boardroom politics and whispered promises to younger, shinier prospects. But it was the leak that set fire to the powder keg. An internal email from the aerodynamics department, accidentally forwarded to a junior engineer, ended up in the wrong hands. Within hours, it had made its way up to Hamilton's inner circle. The contents? Staggering. It showed that Toto Wolff had initiated contact with Charles Leclerc's agent months before Hamilton's deal with Ferrari had been finalized. Not days. Not weeks. Months. The implication was crystal clear. Mercedes had emotionally moved on from Hamilton long before the public knew it. They were already preparing for a post-Hamilton era while pretending to be committed to the man who built their dynasty. To Lewis, it was confirmation of every creeping doubt, every late-night thought that maybe, just maybe, he was no longer their priority. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a calculated erasure of everything he had meant to them. And in the eye of that storm, after the confrontation, after the security team escorted him away like a liability rather than a legend, Hamilton vanished into the night like a shadow melting into the desert. His entourage formed a tight circle around him, shielding him from the flashes of cameras and the prying eyes of the media. He refused to speak. He didn't acknowledge the reporters screaming his name. He didn't even glance back at the building where his legacy had just been set on fire. Toto, meanwhile, declined medical attention. But insiders say his cheek bore a mark, subtle but unmistakable. A reddish-blue imprint from the encounter. In the hours that followed, he was seen behind closed doors, ice pack pressed tightly against his face, in a room full of nervous executives, trying to extinguish a 5-alarm inferno with corporate jargon and strategic denial. The shareholders were livid. The sponsors were rattled. The entire infrastructure of Mercedes-AMG Petronas looked like it had just survived a hurricane, except the eye of the storm had been their own creation. And the world? The world was watching every frame, dissecting every whisper, turning the sport upside down in real time. Because this wasn't a racing incident. This wasn't just paddock drama. This was a seismic event. And its aftershocks are just beginning. George Russell, wide-eyed and visibly shaken, was the one pushed in front of the cameras the next morning. Mercedes knew what they were doing. Send out the quiet one, the diplomatic one, the one who wouldn't dare stray from the script. And oh, did he stick to it. Every word that came out of his mouth had clearly been massaged, sanitized, and stitched together by a swarm of PR specialists burning the midnight oil. There was a misunderstanding. Emotions were high. Everyone has moved on. Those were the words he was told to say. But his eyes? His eyes were screaming. He had witnessed something no driver should ever have to see, a moment that rewrote every belief he held about what power, pride, and betrayal looked like at the highest level of motorsport. Inside the corridors of the FIA, the whispers started before the sun rose. Senior officials were summoned to private briefings. Not public statements, mind you, but hushed, behind-the-scenes debriefs full of carefully chosen words and long, uncomfortable silences. No official complaints were filed. Mercedes didn't dare put ink to paper. The image was everything. But sources close to the matter confirmed that internal legal teams were already assembling a contingency plan, just in case the situation spiraled into something even more catastrophic. It's better to be ready, one insider reportedly said, than caught off guard when the dam finally breaks. Ferrari? Not a word. Not a whisper. Not a tweet. Their social media accounts, normally buzzing with banter and red-colored bravado, went completely dark. No memes, no race previews, not even a subtle hint of humor. Absolute digital blackout. And it wasn't incompetence. It was cold calculation. They knew exactly what had happened behind those closed doors. Hamilton didn't just swing at Leclerc, he struck at the very heart of the empire he had helped build. It wasn't a punch thrown in the heat of the moment. It was a message. And Ferrari, with all their decades of political mastery, weren't about to interrupt a storm that was blowing straight through Brackley like a tornado with a personal grudge. Privately, Hamilton was incandescent. No longer the media-trained knight of the paddock, no longer the careful corporate ambassador. In the sanctuary of his inner circle, his words burned like gasoline on fire. "That man used me," he said, his voice reportedly low and cold. "Then he threw me away. Tonight, he learned what that costs." Those weren't just words. They were a warning. A declaration. A war cry aimed straight at the man who had once been his greatest ally. Toto Wolff, always so polished, always so controlled, didn't issue a single statement. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. He simply disappeared. But people close to him say he wasn't silent out of weakness. He was silent because the chess game had just entered a new brutal phase. One of his oldest confidants, a man who's been in Toto's orbit for over a decade, was overheard muttering something bone-chilling to a team member. "He's not the type to forgive. And believe me, this isn't over. Not by a long shot." And maybe it truly isn't. Because what ignited in Bahrain wasn't a rivalry. It was the implosion of something once sacred, a dynasty that dominated a decade, now torn apart by ego, betrayal, and one violent moment that no camera captured. This wasn't Senna versus Prost. This wasn't Vettel's fury or Verstappen's rage. This was something darker. Something raw. A father figure and his chosen warrior, locked in a spiral of mutual destruction. No Netflix crew caught it. No boom mic recorded the sound. There was no polished documentary scene. Only blood. Real blood. On cold tile. Shattered glass glinting under sterile lights. Stunned faces frozen in place, as the air turned thick with disbelief and something close to fear. In that one unrepeatable moment, Formula One didn't just witness drama, it witnessed a seismic rupture. The rules changed. The relationships changed. And deep down, whether they'll admit it or not, everyone in the paddock knows that Bahrain was the night Formula One took off its mask and showed its true face. Not all glamour. Not all glory. But power. Naked, unforgiving power. And now, the whole world is watching, waiting to see what happens next.